welcome to another Victory Vision podcast. And we're thankful for you joining us. And if you have any type of questions, things like that, we encourage you to please let us know, write us, or send us an email or text or something through the church and let us know if you have anything we can try to answer for you. And I hope these are a blessing to you. We've got lots of feedback from different people saying that this has been a help to them. So I'd encourage you, please share this with people that you know that you think maybe could be blessed and helped by it. This one we're wanting to talk about for this Victory Vision is going to be pressures and kind of pressures that we face in life and how we navigate through those pressures and what we're supposed to be doing. And we were talking about, Micaiah's with me today, and we've been talking about some of the pressures like Valentine's Day. I mean, yesterday was yesterday was Valentine's Day? I don't even forget what day it was Valentine's Day. But it was Valentine's Day, and I think it was the day before yesterday, as a matter of fact. And this shows you how much pressure I had with it. But and I was telling him, there's a lot of pressure. Like, hey, what did you get your spouse for Valentine's Day? And what are you doing? And if you said nothing, it's like, well, you don't love your spouse. There's pressure, to try to do those things. And I was telling Micaiah, I said, my wife is fantastic. She's wonderful. Please send this to her if you can afterwards, so she'll know that I said that. But she's like, hey, let's don't celebrate on the 14th. Let's always celebrate on the 15th or 16th. That way, all the chocolate and flowers are half price. And I'm like, man, what a prize! She's far above Ruby. She's wonderful. But I thought I'm going to surprise her. I went to the store and bought some. I bought her and our daughter a Valentine's stuff. But I went in, like the flowers were expensive, the candy was expensive, and all these guys are like, there's like tons of men walking around going, "Can you believe the prices?" And one guy walked up to me and he said, "Can you believe $75 for roses?" And I said, "Let's do this, dude." I said, "Let's split the price. I'll take 6 of the roses. You take 6 of the roses. Let's get out of here." He's like, "That's a great idea." So there's just a lot of pressure, on us in our environment with a lot of different things. And I saw in the morning, the news this morning was about gun control issues and news media asking senators about what they're doing with gun control and saying, don't you care that kids are being killed? And so it's almost like if you don't see things the way I see them, maybe I think all guns should be gone, and maybe this senator is saying, well, I think we need to have better measures in place.
Right.
And so the media person is like, well, you just don't care about children being killed. So I do care about it, but it's not, the way you see it. So there's always pressure, to see it the way I see it, to conform the way I'm doing it. The media nowadays and movies and trying to pressure us to adopt a different way of viewing marriage and gender and all that stuff. There's just a lot of pressures around us to conform to something, and it creates a difficult to navigate through that. Creates a lot of difficulty to try to figure out how to get through the pressures. Some of the pressures come from our churches, some come from our families, some come from our parents, some come from our friends, some come from our coworkers. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how do we work through some of those pressures. And Brother Micaiah and I have been kind of talking about that from, maybe an older generation of looking at it. He's a younger generation of looking at it. And he had some really good ideas about how he is navigating through some of these pressures. And so I want him to kind of address some of that with us a little bit first.
Yes, sir. So to kind of address kind of the outside external versus internal pressures, I know with me, having a big desire to be in ministry and to try to be a help to people, try to make an impact, which I believe all of us want to be successful. I believe all of us want to make an impact and make a dent before we hit the ground, if you will. And talking about the external pressures with being in ministry, I've told a lot of people that, we want to start churches. We want to go out here into Texas and try to reach as many areas as possible. And you start telling people what you want to do, and now you have a bunch of different people in ministry that say, hey, why aren't you further along? Why haven't you started a church yet? Why haven't you? And you have all these outside external pressures of, okay, you said you were going to do this. Why aren't you farther along yet? And you have all these different pressures that come from the outside that you just can't focus on. And we're going to kind of get to this about focusing more on what God thinks of you than what others think. but it does get to some of that internal pressures. I was talking with Brother Eric earlier about 1 Kings 19. You know, I personally believe with all my heart that Elijah, he wanted nothing more than to be a success both spiritually and for his family, for his fathers and things like that. And he went there trying to make a difference. And when he didn't feel like that there was a revival or there was a big nationwide change towards God, you know, he ends up being depressed, and he ends up saying in 1 Kings 19:4, I am not better than my fathers. Because we all have this idea of success. We all have this mindset of, okay, I want to make an impact. I want to live a life that helps change for others. And we start putting these expectations on ourselves and these internal pressures on ourselves to live up to something. And we put all these pressures on ourselves to be something. And when in reality, we could put unnecessary expectations on ourselves. And when we don't meet those expectations, like I've talked to a lot of people that are around my age, they didn't get married at the same time they think they would get married. They weren't having kids by this time. They weren't at a specific job at a point, and you know where they want it. And they put all these internal pressures on themselves and unnecessary expectations, which leads them discouraged in their life. And what I was hearing my brother say the other day, he said, I think that's why you have a lot of midlife crisis in the world, because you get to a certain point, you're aiming for all these big things that you want to accomplish, and when you don't reach them, that's when you're like, man, well, I spent my whole life up to this point trying to reach this goal, and I've not reached it yet. And you have all these internal pressures of trying to reach something, and I think it can kind of get you in a bind sometime when you think about it.
Okay, so this is, you know, we always kind of talk about these before, and then they always kind of take on their own kind of form as we go with this. And when you brought that up, talking about that, expectation is a key part of this, because, you know, when he said, I'm no greater than my fathers, well, who told him he was going to be greater than his fathers? Who told him that he's going to be a more successful than the generation before him in doing it?
Right.
When actually what he did was exactly what God wanted him to do. And there is success found. It is successful. You are successful when you have done what God asked you to do. Success is not really measured in how much you have to show at the end. It's more measured in how faithful you were to the end.
Right.
And I think that you know, when somebody says, well, my church runs 300 and your church runs 50, or let's say it from a different perspective, I only run 50 and they run 300. Yes, but were you faithful in what God gave you to do? It's not about the numbers as it is about you being faithful. And so when we talk about success, you're right. Everyone wants to be successful. They want to know that they mattered,
right?
That they did something. Well, he kind of tell you something that's really interesting. Elijah mattered. He mattered, even though in his mind at that moment, his expectation was, I would matter in this way. But God wrote it down in His Word. He mattered there.
Right.
He mattered, and so sometimes I think we get our minds a little bit off on what success looks like and what it is. And you're exactly right. That's a great point you just brought up with that, and expectations we put on ourselves, and we let people put on us, and then we put inwardly on ourselves.
Right.
And when we don't meet them, I'm at the midlife crisis age right now. I'm there, and when you said that, you're exactly right. I've been thinking about that lately. Like, all right, what have I done that has mattered, and what will I leave that has mattered? And we put that pressure on ourselves to matter. And here's the deal. Well, did I reach 1,000 people? Well, what if I only reached 5? And that's what I was given to do. Right. That's success. And I'm not using it as an excuse to be lazy, to say, well, I just don't do anything, because we make full proof of our ministry. But we want to matter. But what I'm doing matters to God. Right. It doesn't matter what the guy down the road is doing.
Right.
It only matters what I'm supposed to do for God in doing it. So that's a great point you're bringing up. I like that.
No, I agree 100%. And that's a fantastic point you brought up, in the sense that God never told him that he was going to have this nationwide revival or any of these things, but he put that pressure on himself to accomplish those things. And
It's a
I
good
think
desire to have.
it's a good desire to have.
Yeah.
But I think in the same time, I mean, you should want to achieve great things for God, but at the same time, when you don't achieve those things, you should be long suffering to yourself.
Yeah.
I think God's long suffering to us, and sometimes we're long suffering to others, but we're never long suffering to ourselves. And that's something that Brother Aaron Bibb preached one time, because I am in a habit of wanting to reach a goal. And I think when you get saved, you're just like, man, I don't want to ever sin again. I don't want to ever make any more mistakes. And then when you make mistakes, you start beating yourself up. Man, I shouldn't be making mistakes at this point in my life. I should be over here. I should be like Paul. I should win someone to the Lord as I'm sleeping. I should have all these things accomplished. And so we have to be long suffering to ourselves when we're going towards these things. But we also can't compare ourselves, because everybody's story is different. And I was thinking about John the Baptist as well. From a man's point of view, a lot of us wouldn't look at John and say he was successful with what he did. We would say, okay, he preached, he was in the middle of the wilderness, and he was yelling all the time, and he did all these things, and he ended up in prison. And we would look at his life and say he wasn't successful, but Jesus looked at him way differently than he looked at, or others would have looked at him, and he looked at himself. And Jesus said there's none greater than John the Baptist.
Yeah.
But from our perspective, we're like, man, he wasn't really that successful. From a fleshly perspective is what I mean. And from him looking at himself, he's like, man, are you really the one that's to come, or should we look for another? Why he was doubting himself, and why maybe others would look at him and say, oh man, John's in prison. If he didn't actually live for God the way he was supposed to, he would have never ended up in prison. When we look at that perspective, Jesus says, man, there's nobody. He did what I wanted him to do. He led the way for me. He did what others may think that, man, why in the world is John in the wilderness doing all these things? But he did his mission for what God wanted him to do. And that is true success, is doing things for God, not worrying about what others, because like you made reference earlier, comparison among ourselves is not wise. And we can look at what others are doing and how other lives are. But in reality, we need to say, okay, what has God told me to do? I'm going to do that, and that is success. That's what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah. You were mentioning, I don't know if you were planning on going there again, but Psalm 73, about how sometimes we can start looking at all the world around us and looking at what they're doing, and then even saying, am I doing what I'm doing in vain? I'm trying to live for God. I'm trying to do it this way.
Right.
And the rest of the world around me, are people over here, seem to be successful in what they're doing, and I say in quote successful, like the way the world views it. They're making money, they've got the cars, they've got the houses, and I don't seem to have that, what I'm doing. And you had brought that up the other day when we were talking about it, and until he went into the sanctuary,
right?
And then it said then he understood their end, and so what it was is he got his perspective away from just looking at all these things and feeling the pressure of being like the Joneses, or like somebody down the street. And then he got his focus back on, all right, but that's not what success is.
Right.
Success, I figured out what success is when I walked in the sanctuary.
Right.
And I got my focus on what God says success should be.
Right.
And I realized there's an end coming to all of us. And it's something you see in 1 Timothy 6. That's kind of like treasures that I lay up for in heaven, as opposed to treasures that would corrupt here on earth. And I'm not saying that someone that's successful in this world, that they have corruptible treasures.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that all rich people are bad people. I'm just saying that sometimes we put that pressure on ourselves, when really when we go into the sanctuary, our perspective gets put back in the right place. We realize success is not always measured the way man measures it. It's more measured the way God measures it.
Well, I think that we're even in the position of Asaph as well. Not even when we look at just the world, because we do compare ourselves. I'm whenever I looked at all these celebrities that have all this money and all these things, and you start thinking, well, man, they're really successful. But we can not only from Asaph's perspective look at the world and they're succeeding, but I think from Asaph's perspective, we look at people that are spiritual that are succeeding, and we say, okay, well, they're succeeding and they're doing good, and I'm not. And we start looking at someone, like you said earlier, that has 500 people, but we have 10 people. And I think even if, I started thinking in light of starting all these churches that we were wanting to, and I don't know what paths God's going to take us. God could say, you know what, I just want you to stay at this church, and I'm completely content with that. But even if we were to start all these churches, if we were to win one person to Christ, that would be worth the whole thing. And we say that right now, but when we're in the midst of it, we don't think that. We think I've only led one person to Christ.
That rolls off the tongue so eloquently.
So
like if
eloquently.
I just win one,
Yeah.
it was worth it all.
Right.
But
Right.
then whenever we've only got one that we're really working with, we're like, man, how come I don't have more than one? I'm a failure.
Right.
Right.
I mean, all of heaven's rejoicing over one sinner that
Yes.
repenteth, and we're down here beating
Grumbling.
ourselves up
Yeah.
while the angels and everybody, or there's, I don't know, there's rejoicing in the presence of the
Yeah,
angels, I guess is how it's said. But either way, they're still rejoicing in heaven. And we're down here saying we got one person that we led to the Christ. But that's amazing. That's what we're called to do, is to witness to people and to share the gospel with people. But, we put these expectations.
Let me say it this way. Your dad we've always joked with your dad, Brother Freddie, about the itchy trigger finger. Like, we're always wanting this, the drop of the hat, to go to a field and start a church and lead people to the Lord. And you want to see, a large amount of people affected for Christ and walking with God,
Right.
and having families and stuff like that. And I've always felt like, I might want to put words in his mouth, I always felt like he's felt like, man, I could do more. I could do more. But he's affected a lot of people, teach him the Bible.
Right.
And maybe he's got a handful of people he's affected, but those handful of people that he's affected are affecting hundreds of people.
Right.
And they would not be affecting hundreds of people if he had not affected those 5 or 6 or 10 or whatever it is. And so someone might look at that and say, well, you only affected, 5, 10 people. You weren't as successful as this guy down here. Yeah, but I affected
Right.
5 people and spent time with those people that affected a lot of people. I've told some younger guys, said, was Jesus a success for a failure? Well, he was successful. Yeah, but if you were standing along with him and watching that he's walking with 12 people, and one of them's a thief, and 2 of them are hotheads, and one denies him, and when you get to the actual cross, there's only one that's there. I mean, you would say, man, that wasn't an extremely successful ministry. But then you look at the fruit that came out of it afterwards,
Right.
and you say, okay, it was successful. We don't have a good view of what success and
Right.
failure is sometimes.
Right. And we can't look at our perspective from right now in the midst of it, because there ain't no telling what's going on behind the
Correct.
scenes. And I remember a story one time. There was this guy. He had never led anybody to the Lord personally. All he did was hand out tracts. He went to a corner. He handed out tracts every single day, but he never led one person to the Lord. And come to find out later, they had this big old meeting, and they were giving out testimonies, just sharing how they got saved. And the majority of the congregation got up saying, there was a man that stood on a corner that handed me a tract, and I got saved that way.
Yeah.
The guy never knew
Right.
that all those people had gotten saved, but because of his faithfulness and his work for the Lord, I mean, he might have looked, and he might have been sitting at his house saying, man, I handed out all those tracts. I've never led anybody to the Lord. There's so many people that have led all these people to the Lord. But really, in all reality, if you're serving the Lord, there is no telling, you're planting all these seeds. There's no telling all the harvest that's coming up somewhere else that you've not seen yet. And even if you don't see it here, one day when you stand before God, he's like, well done, thou good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
You did all of this for me. I know you didn't see as much down there, but now you look at all these things that you get now.
Well, think about it in this way. We were bringing up the thing about the widow's mite earlier. Brother James was, who, by the way, is behind the scenes doing all the audio stuff for us. But James had brought up, Jesus stopping the disciples and saying, hey, y'all gather over here and look. Did you see how everybody's been putting in the treasury, putting in money? Did you see that widow? She put in that little bit. And he actually said that little bit she put in was more than the great amounts that other people had put in. And now from the man's point of view, they were like, no, I think you're mistaken. Your math is off here.
Right.
I saw the large pile they put in and a little bit that she put in. You're mistaken. In man's eyes, it's this.
Right.
But in God's eyes is, no, she did way more than they did.
Right.
And so sometimes our view of it is completely different than the other view. And what you were talking about at the beginning was sometimes this, the things that we've experienced in our life, that we see with our eyes, that we watch other people, it has an inward effect on us that makes us start to feel like, I don't feel like I'm much of a success, or that I matter, or that it has a way of kind of working inside of us.
Right.
And that's what this whole thing's about. We've got to learn how to navigate through this and see through all the pressures and just keep our focus on desiring to delight in the Lord and to please God with what we're doing. And that, Jesus always did that which pleased the Father. And I think we've got to always be just focusing on pleasing the Lord and not trying to worry about comparing ourselves with other people and expectations we put on ourselves based on what other people are doing around us and what we think we should be at in life because of where they're at in life. And I think all of that is really, really good stuff to kind of think through.
Amen.
Did you have something else you want to add to that? Because I had something else I want to finish with, unless you have something you want to add to that.
Well, one more thing, if you don't mind, with the comparison thing. I was listening to the news yesterday. I never listened to the news. I was meeting someone for lunch, and the news was on, and they said 1 out of 3 girls consider suicide, and they found out that the source of that is how much they're on social media. And what I've come to find out in my own life personally is you start viewing everybody else's life, the highlight reels. You see them at a party, you see them, with a bunch of friends, you see them, all these things, these great things that are happening, and you start looking at your own life and saying, man, I never have fun. Man, I don't have any friends. Man, I don't. And you start comparing yourself, and that's what's led to a lot of depression. That's what's led to a lot of comparison. Because you look at your own life and say, man, I don't have as many friends as so-and-so, or I'm not having as good a time as so-and-so.
I don't look like so-and-so, or dress like so-and-so.
Exactly. And so you start comparing yourself, and then you put the expectations on yourself. You end up going to depress, and that's why the 1 out of 3 women consider suicide. But what we've come back to say earlier is don't compare yourself. God has made you for the person you are, a phenomenal person that's in Christ, that's, your identity is in Christ. And that's what they actually said on the news, which was really cool. But you can't compare yourselves. You can just get excited that God made you a unique individual that God's going to use to do amazing things, and just focus on Him. Don't focus on comparing yourself with other people, what other people is doing, what you think the success is. Just focus on pleasing God, because that is success, and you should be excited about that.
I was just preaching one time about something very similar to that, and this just hit me. And there's a guy in our church that's a locksmith, and he was in the back working on the sound at the time, and I was preaching, and I looked up and I saw him, and this whole thing just kind of came together in my mind. And that is, you take a key, just a blank piece of metal, and then somebody comes along with tools. The master comes along with tools and masterfully begins to cut things away from it and design it in a way that is unique from every other piece of metal out there. If that key could talk, it'd be screaming the whole time, going, "This isn't fair. This doesn't feel good. I'm just like everybody else. I'm not like anybody. I'm like any other key. I feel so odd." But that key has actually been made perfect to fit into a unique lock to open something that no other piece of metal could open. And you're unique, but you're unique on purpose to do something that nobody else could accomplish and nobody else could do. And I think sometimes we, if we could use that analogy to say that we look around and say, well, I'm not like anybody else. Yeah, you're perfect.
Right.
You're perfectly you, and you don't have to be anybody else.
Right.
And so I would say this, maybe, some preacher says, I'm not like Pastor so-and-so down the road. I know, you're perfectly you. You may have a different style, a different technique, a different delivery, a different way that you speak, the way you do things, and you can be perfectly you. Now, I'm not talking about I'm so unique that I don't use the Bible anymore, or I don't believe Jesus is God, or I'm not talking about that kind of, I'm just talking about your practices and how your personality is and what you do is perfectly you.
Right.
And you are a key that unlocks. There'll be people that will come to your church because they've got a lock that only you fit. And they may not go to the church down the road. And so we're just a little bit different, and that's okay that we're unique. I thought about this. This guy I wanted to end with it was, we were sitting around talking about this last week, and we're trying to fit this in a 25, 30-minute podcast. And we all sat around and talked with other men and other preachers even last week for like 3 hours about this subject. And so we don't have that time. But one of the things that brought up is Pastor Miller from our church, one of our children's pastor, he brought up Colossians 3:21. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. And I thought about, an older generation to a younger generation. We're trying to provoke people, fathers to children, pastors to people. Maybe me to trying to mentor younger men. They're doing stuff. We're trying to provoke them to love and good works towards doing things. And sometimes, the way a father might work with his children, that father might do this. He might say, well, my father taught me this way, and so now I'm going to teach you this way. And my father was a carpenter, and so I'm a carpenter, and you need to be a carpenter. And we start placing pressure. And my dad, I responded to my dad's words and my dad's actions this way, and this is the way I was trained to do it, and that's what I'm going to do with you. And we can end up provoking them. Provoking's not necessarily bad as long as we don't provoke them based on our experience. We provoke them in a way that maybe isn't that good. When he said that the other day, talking about a father with his children, like based on his experiences, now he's putting those same experiences into his children, and then this carries on, and maybe that's maybe that way that it worked with you may not necessarily work with them the same way,
Right.
and we're actually provoking them towards anger and discouragement. And I thought about that when he said it. It rang true with where I'm at in ministry, working with other men, and where I've been in ministry.
Right.
That there are some, I would say, men that have been kind of fathers to me in the faith that have said, this is based on my experience, you need to do this. You preach this way, you talk this way, you teach this way, you carry yourself this way, you do things this way. And I've watched the way they've done it. And that's not really who I am. I'm not really that style or that way. And because I don't really fit that way, it's caused a little bit of discouragement in me that I'm not like them.
Right.
But that rolls right back around to two things. One, I have to be careful that I'm not trying to put my issues and how I do stuff on you to say, you have to be just like me, because that's not a fair way of
Right.
trying to push you. But you've got to be careful that you don't put this implied pressure on yourself that I say, well, bless God, I always wear white shirts when I'm preaching. And the next thing you know, you're thinking that only the only guys that are truly right with God are the ones that wear white shirts while they preach.
Right.
Some kind of little pressures like that are kind of unspoken. I was at a meeting one time, and as a young preacher, and an older man got up and said, I'm wondering why some of you men don't wear suits anymore. You wear sports coats now, and instead of suits, sports coats and slacks. And he said, I wonder if we've lost a love and a reverence for God and for the position. Well, that was a pressure that was placed on a young men that's kind of like, man, I'm not as good as that. I think we just got to be careful. I think that to kind of close this out with a thought, I think we got to be careful about the pressures we're putting on. What is success? Things that don't really matter that we're putting on
Right.
these guys. And I think we just got to be real careful about how when I would go to Brother Fisher's all the time, Brother Fisher would say for leadership conference, he would say, I don't want to hear any of you men walking around talking about how many you run in your church. I don't want you to say, how you doing? And then how many people do you have in your church? He said, stop with how are you doing? And he said, because we're putting pressure on other men to be like us, like, well, I run 100, well, I run 50. And we almost make them feel like they're not as good as the other ones that run more. And I think we're putting pressure on each other to conform to stuff that really doesn't matter sometimes, and we're creating an environment that's discouraging
Right.
with each other. And so these are all really good points to bring up. Did you have something else? You look like you were going to say something else. All right, so I just think this is a good way to kind of look at this issue. The thing you brought up at the end about social media and about young ladies feeling that way, that's unfortunate that's the environment kind of we live in. And I wish they could get a hold of the truth that they are who they are in Christ. They make a big difference in their life. So it's a great podcast to think about. It'd be good to maybe do another one maybe down the road about this same type of thing, and
Right.
maybe explore a little bit of this a little bit more. And I hope that'd be a help. I hope this has been a help to you to kind of think through some of these things and maybe work through some of them. If you have any questions or thoughts along with it that you'd like to address to us, and we can maybe try to put out there, please do that and let us know, and we'll try to be a help to you. We love you. Please share this with somebody you think might be a help to them, and we look forward to seeing you next time. God bless.